Good evening, everyone. So today we will be looking at circulatory system as a transport material throughout the body. So firstly, as I always say, we got to focus on the anatomy, followed by the physiology, and then the mechanism, so that it makes it easier for us to understand the whole content. And it's like if you go through these stages, it's also easier for you to study the content as well and make your flashcards and make your own notes as well. So first of all, we'll be looking at the anatomy of the heart. So the heart contains four chambers, two atriums, the right and the left, and two ventricles, the right and the left. And there are other veins and arteries which assist the blood flow to the body and to the lungs as well. So usually my students find it hard to memorize the anatomy of the heart or study the anatomy of the heart, but I have come up with a solution. So this is the simplified version, right? So they are showing the left and the right ventricle, left and the right atrium, and where the aorta and the pulmonary artery is. So when I was a student, this is one of the diagrams that I came up with. So there's the right atrium, right ventricle, and left ventricle. So those are the four chambers of our heart. And in between the right atrium and the right ventricle, we have our tricuspid valve. So valves, we will be looking at valves in a second. So the valve which is in between right atrium and right ventricle is known as the tricuspid valve. So hence I used number 3 to represent that valve. And then the valve in between left atrium and left ventricle is known as the bicuspid valve, which is also known as the mitral valve. And then the alphabets on top represents the vessels. So for an example, the vessel which is gonna go through the right atrium is known as, it's one of the vein, and it's called the superior vena cava. And then the blood would flow through the right atrium, right ventricle, and come up to pulmonary artery and goes into the lung. And then when it gets oxygenated, it comes back through the pulmonary vein, through the left atrium, to the left ventricle, through the bicuspid valve, and then it is pumped out from the left ventricle through the aorta to all over the body. So this is called the systemic circulatory system. We'll be looking at it in a second. So this is one of the easiest way where you can like I've simplified it in terms of boxes, numbers, and alphabets, so it's easier for you guys to understand the anatomy better. And the next that we are looking at is the type of valves. So as I mentioned before, the tricuspid and bicuspid valves are also known as the atrioventricular valve, which means it is in between the atrium and the ventricles. So hence why they are called the atrioventricular valves. And then the second type of valve that we are going to be looking at is the semilunar valves. So the two types of semilunar valves are the pulmonary valve and the aortic valve. So basically, the existence of the valves are crucial to prevent the backward flow of the blood. If there is a backward flow, the muscles of the atrium and the ventricle leads to arrhythmia. So arrhythmia is a condition where there's an irregular heartbeat, and that is not a good sign for a human. And also, the most common question that we always get is, why is the wall of the ventricle is left ventricle is thicker than the right ventricle? So basically, the left ventricle has to work harder to pump blood from the heart throughout like our whole body, like to all the cells, all the tissues. So hence why it has to work harder, so it has a thicker wall. Whereas our right ventricle, it only needs to pump blood from the heart to the lung, so it doesn't need to work as harder as the left ventricle, so hence why it has a thinner wall. Next up, we are going to look at components of blood. So our blood consists of plasma, red blood cell, white blood cells, and platelets, and obviously they have their own functions as well, which we are going to look at it in a second. So plasma is basically a fluid. It is a yellowish fluid with all the minerals and protein. And then there's our red blood cells as well. So the function, so do you know what is the function of red blood cells? So basically the function of red blood cells is to carry oxygen throughout the body, and there is protein which is called hemoglobin, which helps the red blood cell to work efficiently, which we are going to look at it in a minute. And then the white blood cells, they are basically our soldiers in our body to fight pathogens. So pathogens are anything foreign or our body can't recognize, and it is not supposed to enter our body. So these white blood cells would sort of fight them off. And platelets is there to aid in blood clotting. So if you are hurt, or if you have a tear and there's and you are bleeding, so that's when platelets come into action, and with the aid of other clotting agents, they sort of work together to form blood clot to prevent humans from losing further from losing blood. So this is the blood composition. So basically our blood consists of 55% of plasma, 1% of buffy coat, and 45% of erythrocytes. So the buffy coat consists of platelets and leukocytes. So there are different terminologies that we are going to look at today. So white blood cells are also known as leukocytes. So there's 5 types of white blood cells. We are going to look at it in a minute. And then erythrocytes is another term for red blood cells, and thrombocytes is another term for platelet. So this is basically the structure of our red blood cell. So it has a special unique structure which aids in carrying oxygen. So first up, it has a large surface area so that it could fit the oxygen molecules to carry throughout our body. And then, as I mentioned before, it has a protein called hemoglobin, which picks up the oxygen, obviously. And then it has no nucleus to make room for more oxygen. So basically, like we were talking about red blood cell before, right? It carries oxygen from the lungs to the body, and carbon dioxide from the body back to the lungs, and we exhale the carbon dioxide out of our lung. And this, like I mentioned before, there's 5 types of white blood cells, and I've came up with an acronym. So it is never let monkeys eat bananas. So never, the N, capital N, stands for neutrophil, and let, L, is for lymphocytes. Monkeys, M, is for monocytes. Eat, E, is for eosinophils or eosinophils, however you're gonna pronounce it. And banana, the B, is for basophil. So there's 5 types of leukocytes or white blood cells. that you need to know, and they have their specific functions. So these are their functions for so like for neutrophils, they kill bacteria, fungi, and foreign debris. And for monocytes, they clean up damaged cells. So in our body, all our cells, we produce new cells, and then when it gets older or worn out, it has to be disposed somehow. So that's when monocytes come in and clean up the damaged cells. And then for eosinophil, it kills parasites, cancer cells, and involved in allergic responses. So when you have a certain type of allergy reaction in your body, the level of eosinophil would increase. And for lymphocytes, it helps fight viruses or to make antibodies. So antibodies are basically markers. So like for an example, let's talk about chickenpox, right? So when you had your first exposure to chickenpox, your body would have memories stored in your body, and then those memory cells are called memory cells would produce antibodies against the same exposure when your body is exposed to the same bacteria second time. You get what I mean? So antibodies, so lymphocytes make antibodies. So that's so we will talk more about that, about antibodies and stuff when we are studying immunology. So this is the gist of it. So when you are exposed to a foreign pathogen or bacteria for the first time, your immune system would produce cells which are called the memory cells, and the memory cells is responsible to produce antibodies when it is exposed to the second or third time to protect our body from the same exposure. And then the last one is basophils. So the level of basophils would also increase during allergic response. So the next up, so we already talked about platelets, right? So it is also known as thrombocyte, and the shape of it is irregular. It exists in irregular fragments, and it is very important for blood clotting. And now we are going to look at blood vessels. So the three main blood vessels that we have in our body is arteries, veins, and capillaries, and they have different features. So for an example, arteries, it carries oxygenated blood away from the heart, and veins, they carry oxygenated blood towards the heart. So that's how you sort of differentiate the both of them. And in terms of features, they are different as well. So for an example, the artery, it has a thicker wall with a smaller lumen, and it has an elastic wall as well. And for vein, it has a thinner wall with large lumen, and they have valves. So we talked about valves before. Do you remember what is the function of the valve? The valves? So it has the same function as the valves in the heart to prevent backflow of the blood. As for capillaries, it is single cell wall, and it usually interconnects veins to arteries. And these are the functions in more in detail, and we have already talked about lumen, wall, and wall. And there are other features as well for arteries. So for an example, it exists in muscular walls, and the largest artery in our body is the aorta. And then for vein, it exists in other features. Yeah, we have already talked about other features. So it in vein, there are valves, as we mentioned before, and it exists in order to prevent the backflow of blood. And for capillaries, it is only one cell thick, and usually it's semi-permeable, and it is very essential for the transportation of gases and nutrients. And these are just some extra information. So there's arteries, and then there's arterioles. Arterioles connects arteries to capillaries, and then there's veins, obviously, and then there's venules. So venules connects capillaries and veins. So today we are gonna be looking at the systemic circulation. So this is a very important diagram that we need to know. So the pink arrows shows the pathway of oxygenated blood that enters the heart, and then the blue shows the pathway of deoxygenated blood which leaves the heart. So I sort of explained during the simplified diagram that I was showing before, the pathway. So I'm gonna go through it again. So basically what happens is the deoxygenated blood from the body enters the superior vena cava through the right atrium, and then it goes through the right ventricle through the tricuspid valve, and then it leaves through the pulmonary artery, and it goes to the lungs to be oxygenated. And then when it gets oxygenated, it enters the pulmonary artery through the left atrium, and then it goes to the left ventricle through the mitral valve, or also known as the bicuspid valve. And then when it reaches the left ventricle, it is pumped out through the aorta to the body. So basically that's what it is. So that's the systemic and pulmonary circulation. And next up, we are gonna look at the ABO blood group system. So the AB group is called as the universal recipient because they are able to receive blood from all the other blood groups. And then O is known as the universal donor because they are able to donate blood to everyone else, but they can only receive blood from an O. Okay, so as we are looking at the antigen which is present here, so for blood group A, antigen A is present and there's antibodies of anti-B. And then for group B, there's antigen B present on them, and they have antibodies anti-A. And for AB, there's antigen A and B, but there's no antigens on them, so hence why they can receive blood from all the other blood groups. And as for blood group O, there's no antigen present on them, so hence why they can't receive bloods from any other blood groups except O, because then it would cause agglutination. So we would be looking at the agglutination phenomena in a bit. Yeah, blood group O, they don't have any antigens present on them, but they have antibody, anti-A, and anti-B. So agglutination is basically the process of the clumping of small particles by the agglutinins. So if there's an incompatible blood received by an individual, agglutination happens, which means the blood is sort of rejecting the incompatible blood from the body. So that's what it is. Now we will be looking at the lymphatic system. So the lymphatic system is basically a network of tissues, vessels, and organs that work together. It produces lymph. It's a colorless fluid. Basically, it is produced to maintain the balance of fluid in the body and to also prevent conditions like edema. Edema is basically accumulation of excess fluid in a certain organ or body parts. So it has been 20 minutes, so I will just stop my slide here. Thank you so much for this opportunity.